Good to see you again. It's been a long time.
Yes. Oh dear, don't tell me we're getting this problem again.
Oh no. Oh no.
It's something to do with your setup, I think, because I've been on Zoom almost every day, never seen this problem before.
Oh yeah, sure. Blame me. It's probably
Hey,
it's probably those cross-border. They're testing the packets for COVID to make sure that
they may be about to censor me. That's possible.
they're capturing all of our packets and decomposing them or looking through them as we speak. So did we get a chance to answer your question last time?
Well, I
don't think we did.
I asked three questions, and I don't think we finished the first one. Do you?
Oh, I don't even remember the first one. What was the first question?
Okay, let me. You're going to have to do some editing, I presume. What do you? General question: are you planning on sort of combining the three into one?
Oh no, they're individual episodes.
Okay, so you'll treat each one. Okay,
yeah,
just wondered. Okay, so let me go back to the three questions I asked.
Okay.
The first question is, how will societies cope with a reduction in paid employment?
Oh yeah, that's right. And we agreed to disagree on that, because I don't think there's going to be one, and you think there is.
Well, I think we generally agreed, but disagreed on timing. But maybe we more fundamentally disagreed, which establishes we haven't finished that question.
I think what we got stuck on was the definition of paid employment.
Okay.
Because there's so many variables and colors in that. But just go on.
Okay. I'll come back to the first question then. Second question is, how is government going to react to the associated reduction in income tax, which is essentially our discussion on UBI?
That's a very interesting question.
And then the third question is coming down to today more. How do individuals cope, make wise next job decisions in the light of the impact of convergent technologies, which are taking away jobs?
Let's hit the first one. So you're thinking,
okay.
So governments will have or not elimination, but a huge reduction in taxable income. There'll be a huge reduction in taxable income. Therefore, the amount of income to the government will drop precipitously. So only one of two things can happen. Either they'll have to cut programs, or they will have to increase taxes. And if you think about it, I mean, basically, all we really need to do is look at other states with more social programs, right? Like the UK, or Denmark, or whoever else has more social programs in place. You see sky high taxes in those places on everybody across the spectrum. So anybody who makes any kind of income, there are taxed. So even if you make 10 grand a month, I mean, I think even in Canada, you can make 17 grand a year, and you're still being taxed. So there will be higher taxes across the board for everyone, and we'll be happy about it because we're getting all these great services in return from the government, right?
Yes.
Oh, did you think I was being sarcastic?
It did occur to me. Okay, so firstly, if you look at certainly the Western economies, they are still receiving a substantial amount of income tax in total from corporations and individuals.
Well, I'm going to stop you there, because corporate taxes are just individual taxes aggregated, because corporate taxes are paid for by increasing the price of the product, right? So there's no really such thing as a corporate tax. So even though corporations pay 25% tax or 15% tax or whatever they pay, that 25% tax is immediately passed on to the next person in line. So there is really no such thing as corporate tax, even though they pay corporate tax. It's almost double taxation because we're paying for it in the price of the product, and we're also paying for it when we buy the product. But go on.
Well, actually, I can stay with that one for the moment. And while I haven't heard it expressed that way, my initial thinking is there is no such thing as income taxes, almost using the same logic.
Mm-hmm.
Because if you look at the cost of a product, it includes the cost of labor, and the cost of labor includes the income taxes paid by the individual, because
Right.
you get paid 50,000, you have. So what happens is you get 50,000. The cost to the business that hires you is 50,000.
That's right. But a portion of that goes back to the state.
Well, the portion of that goes back to the state, just like the corporate taxes, which are also included in that, go back to the state.
Yeah.
So my sense is that you can't raise income taxes sufficiently high to counter the impact on the loss of paid employment. And my theory, at least, is the answer is consumption taxes.
Well, yeah, and consumption taxes have been, like, for example, Canadian GST, HST now, VAT in other countries. So yes, consumption taxes will appear, and they'll get higher and higher as they go. But I think you're also forgetting, although you may be getting to this. Actually, let me let you finish, and then you can tell me if I'm right.
Basically, if the amount of money received from income taxes gets less and less, which is my thesis, then the overhead cost of handling the income tax, both on the accounting side, both government and individual, et cetera, the infrastructure costs associated with income tax becomes a higher and higher percentage of the amount of money that is involved. And
exactly.
Therefore, the income tax side of things becomes less and less practical. You know, you tax, you get $10,000 worth of tax, and it costs you $9,000 of infrastructure.
Right.
Not worthwhile. So I do believe that a consumption tax is the inevitable primary method of government income. And what I believe is the most effective way of doing that is going to be a layered consumption tax. So, for example, you might have a 5% consumption tax on staples. You might have a 50% tax on general stuff, and you might have a 300% tax when you want to buy that Lamborghini.
or a 300% tax on soda because we want behavioral change, and a 300% tax on McDonald's because we also want behavioral change, because we know that eating McDonald's leads you to obesity, which leads you to medical issues, which covers your basic universal health care, which we haven't even touched upon yet.
Well, no, we haven't. And you've actually inadvertently, perhaps, brought up a whole different issue, which is before any of these things really impact in terms of the changes in taxation, we're going to have a cashless society. And if you look at the way that the central bank digital currencies are being set up, they will in fact be able to stop you from buying that from McDonald's.
Mhm.
If you've
Yep.
maybe you'll be allowed to have one hamburger a week. But
Yep.
if you want to have, my usual example is Krispy Kreme donuts. And you may well be told you're overweight, so you can't buy the Krispy Kreme donut.
Yeah, you can walk into it and you can try to slap your credit card down or use your cashless payment, and it won't let you. It'll say, your money's not good here.
Your smartphone, and
Yeah.
and so you're going to be totally reliant on skinny friends to buy the donuts for you, right?
Kind of like when you had an older friend buy you liquor.
That is exactly analogous. I mean, I agree. That's the way it's going to be. So I bring that up because while I agree with the logic of what you're saying, that there would be a higher tax to deter, we will have gone past the point where government needs to do sort of implied behavior modification by taxation to the point where they will just basically stop you from doing something.
Oh, no, I disagree with that, because they could just as easily stop selling cigarettes, but they just make so much tax revenue out of cigarettes, out of the sin taxes in Canada, right? I mean,
right.
What are the sin taxes? Booze, fuel, and smokes,
and
right?
Yep.
So they make too much income through taxing the sin as opposed to banning the sin, right?
Well, yes, that's a valid argument. I agree with you. I think, though, and there's no real answer here, other than if you are going to reorganize the tax system, which I think is inevitable. I don't know what the percentages are in the US, but I know in Canada that just over 50% of federal government revenue comes from income tax.
Mm-hmm.
So when you reduce that substantially, you're forced to reorganize or reconsider how you're going to tax. And it may well be that some products, like the sin products, are ones that you don't mind taxing or having a consumption tax on, rather than using your power to stop people, because you don't want to stop them, honestly.
Mm-hmm.
The point you're making, because you want the
Yeah.
revenue from them. So yes, you may have a special layer for sin taxes, but I think the point I'm making is that if you take a more intelligent view to consumption taxes, rather than just having the one HST, GST, whatever tax, then you can do some interesting things that make sense. And one of the things is the cost. It's interesting. This isn't a side point, but back in the 1970s, I had one of those aha moments.
Mm-hmm.
Here is my Nobel Prize thought. Yeah, we all have one of those at some stage in our lives if we're thinkers. And my thinking was exactly that. Let's get rid of income tax. Let's replace it with a consumption tax. Because when you go into the details of eliminating income tax, it's not just the taxation from the government's point of view, it's that the cost of living drops drastically. Because if I'm charging $50 for this product, as we've already discussed, within that $50 are the taxes I have to pay and the labor, and within the labor are the taxes for the individuals.
Mm-hmm.
So if you eliminate all of that, the basic cost of production has gone way down, significantly down.
Yeah, and salaries will drop to
Salaries
match that, because whatever you're paying is what you're taking home. And you're right. I mean, in fact, a lot of economists have said just that. Like, the consumption tax is a progressive tax, whereas the income tax is a regressive tax. So if you taxing consumption is what economists actually prefer. By the way, I do have a degree in economics from my original degree was economics
At York.
as well as philosophy.
At York, right?
But yeah, so economists agree that, yeah, that's exactly right. I mean, in fact, it'd be better if we flipped to a complete consumption tax and forgot about the income tax.
And that
I mean, there's a couple of reasons why we can't do that yet. And I love your concept of being able to tax in sort of individual items at different rates. But that requires, you do need the cashless society to be there in place, because you need that infrastructure that's advanced enough to be able to say, you know, product A is taxed at this amount, product B is taxed. It's already difficult enough to get businesses to say, okay, we have, you know, I know in Canada you have the tax for takeout, and you have a tax for not takeout, and you have a tax for this, you have a different tax for that. I mean, in this county, we have a 9.25% tax, which is 9% state and 0.25% county tax. And if you just think about the systems, that the infrastructure would have to be in place to be able to tax almost every item separately, because you'd have different categories of items, right? But you might get to the point where you'll say, okay, this is taxed by caloric count, or this is taxed by carbohydrate count, or this is taxed by amount of GMO. So if you think about all the ways you could tax things, you could, that'd be a ton of things. But I noticed you didn't mention the other tax that I was going to say that you were going to mention. So should I go ahead and mention it?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. Wealth tax. What about the wealth tax? I mean, I'm sure that there's governments out there eyeing all of this money that Bezos and Gates and Elon Musk have in their bank accounts, going, wow, that guy's got, you know, almost $1 trillion in his account. Why can't we just tax his wealth as opposed to taxing his income?
Oh, do I have some comments on that one? But
I mean, I don't want to do that. I don't want to do that. I'm totally against that, but I would love to hear your thoughts.
Overall, I'm going to make one overall statement and then come back. And my overall statement is, well, taxes do not work, never have worked, never will work. But we can come back to that in a moment. I want to tell you a story about my dear late mother. Now, Mum had some wonderful personal qualities, most of which I didn't appreciate until after she was gone, but that's a whole different story. But she really did. She was a very loving, very caring woman. But when it came to finance, she didn't have a clue. And I want to illustrate that to get back to your comment about Bezos and family and people. She was the younger daughter of 4, and my grandparents, maternal grandparents, came over from Poland/Russia, depending upon where the border was, to England. And he came over with very little money in his pocket. I think he was a successful businessman, so he had contacts. But the story was he started with nothing, built up a very successful business. And all the children had shares. The male children became directors of the business, you know, vice presidents in current speak, and very nicely paid. All drove Rolls Royces.
Very nice.
Very nice. My mother had income from the dividends, but she every day would look at the share price. And she would come downstairs to breakfast and she would be beaming. And we would say, why are you so happy, Mum? And she said, well, my share price has gone up. I've made so much money. I'm now going to go out and spend it. And of course, the alternative was she'd come down miserable saying, I've lost money. No one can spend any on anything today because we don't have any money.
I love it.
But it's the fallacy in what you said that I'm telling that story. And it's a common fallacy. And nobody really thinks about this.
No, everyone thinks that these people are just sitting on piles of money and they're just holding on to them and they're not letting anybody else have access to them. So,
and the truth is, Jeff Bezos gets a very large income from dividends. I have no doubt. But when you start talking about his wealth as being whatever the current value of Amazon shares are, you're talking about something very deceptive.
Mm-hmm.
And people do not think about that. And they will only start to think about it maybe if there is this major drop in shares that will happen, who knows when, in the near future. And when that happens and the share prices go way down, and this, I don't know what he's up to now, 5 trillion, 10 trillion, whatever it is. And
I think he's up near $1 trillion. I don't think apparently the LVMH guy has beat him to the punch globally. But go on.
Okay, so let's say it's $1 trillion, and the shares drop, and now he's only worth 200 billion. Sorry, billion. We've got to get these things right.
Yeah.
Well, I'm not saying that isn't a hell of a lot of money. Of course it is. But it isn't the same thing. And people do not think in terms of that. They think he owns $1 trillion.
Yeah, and that's usually due to politicians and media saying, this guy's got this much, this guy's got this much. So they conflate the concept of worth and actual money in the bank. So it creates these tribes where it's like, oh, they're rich, I'm poor. You know, we got to steal their money. It's Robin Hood time, right?
Yeah, and as always the way with wealthy people that no one gives them credit for is they think that somehow they get all this money and they spend a lot on their yachts and their homes and whatever, and they put the rest in their bed or somewhere under the bed or somewhere. Whereas in practice, and the reason for the wealth gap, in my opinion, a major reason, is they are investors.
Mm-hmm.
And in today's world, we value investment, not we, the economy values investment far greater than it values manual labor.
Yeah.
To me, that's a major factor in this wealth difference that everybody talks about, but no one thinks about it in those terms.
No, because it would be reality.
I think you're right. Let's put it another way. It's easier to provide a simplistic explanation that satisfies people's emotions, and there is no responsibility in our media or almost anybody else to bring in the reality.
Well, I mean, the thing is that they want to show conflict. They want to create tribes that have to defeat each other. So it's rich versus poor, white versus black, this versus that. And if there's no conflict, then there's nothing to talk about. You know, if it bleeds, it leads. So I think we're in that position where almost any piece of news, whether it's good or bad, gets split into these parts that pit people against each other, which is unfortunate.
But I agree with you. But it sells, and the real people to blame is not the media; it's the people.
Mm-hmm.
Because if people said, no, I want the facts, no, I don't want this biased crap that I'm getting, I want the old style editorials, you can express your opinion, just don't tell me it's fact.
Yeah, exactly.
Things like that. And if people accepted that, then we would have a very different society.
So it sounds like we have answered your question. We're going to go to a consumption tax in addition to the income tax. Is that right?
No, total replacement. So why bother? I mean, you've got an infrastructure for the income tax. It's an enormous infrastructure.
Mm-hmm.
It involves a whole bunch of non-productive work. I mean, you've got all the bureaucrats on one side, you've got all the private sector professionals who try to find the loops and deal with the bureaucrats. And
there's a whole industry there. A
It is
whole
enormous,
industry.
enormous, totally non-productive industry.
Mhm.
So if you're going to move to a consumption tax, let's kick out income tax and gain all the advantages.
I'm with you.
Okay.
You and I are in violent agreement on that.
Love it. Love it.
I want to see it. I want to see us go to a complete consumption tax with zero income tax. I mean, it can be done. I'm sure it can be done, and you'll still have plenty of money coming in. And even when you do, if you actually end up moving to a UBI type system, then if you think about it, the government's just clawing back the stuff that you would use if you were consuming it, and it would also reward saving. Right?
Absolutely. And we're on the same wavelength here, violently or otherwise. So coming back in the 1970s, I mentioned this Nobel Prize thought of mine, which was exactly what you described. And I wrote a paper and I spoke to some people who had far more knowledge really on the subject than I did. And they said, yeah, that sort of makes sense. So I tried to get it published, and I approached all the major business newspapers in Canada, and I was told that I was polite. I was very politely, I mean, this is Canada.
It's
so
Canada, yeah.
Yeah, so I was told very politely that it was a pile of rubbish. That was in the 70s. So now we're 50 years later, and I'm still saying this, and now all of a sudden, some people are actually agreeing.
But the problem is they will never give up the income tax. You know what governments are like. They'll never give up sources of income that will come in. Do you remember when the Canadian government decided to slash taxes on cigarettes because they wanted to reduce smuggling? I think that's the only time in my life I have ever heard of a reduction in income tax or any kind of tax.
And I don't know about the US, but I do know that in Canada, income tax was introduced in 1917 as a war tax, as a temporary war tax.
Yeah, same here. Same here.
100 years later, still temporary. But
if they eventually get rid of it, then you can say it was temporary, even though it lasted 100 years.
That gets into a whole area that we're not going to discuss today, I'm sure. But the area of coming chaos and revamping of systems, recognizing that the existing systems that we have, political, economic, social, none of them are working effectively.
Well, let me ask you something though. Let's postulate. Let's go into the future and say some forward-thinking politician somewhere has said, you know what, this is a good plan. We should move to a consumption tax and eliminate the income tax. Wouldn't the consumption tax be then have to be super high, like across the board, just to alleviate the amount of money that we get out of the income tax?
I did some rough numbers with the Canadian federal numbers, and it turns out to be an average of around 35%. So it's not 90% or anything horrendous.
Well, 35% is way less than you're paying in income tax right now.
Well, and probably if everything gets adjusted, it would be more than 35, because we're paying. If you look, you're an economist, so do you remember input-output models?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so the basic concept of an input-output model was you have inputs, they are processed, you have outputs, and so you see what happens when you adjust the inputs, see how they affect the outputs.
Yeah.
Well, if you look at what we've just been talking about, if you look at wages going way down, if you look at costs going way down, then in terms of the economic model, what you do with that in order that government does at least the stuff that they're supposed to do, protection, safety stuff and foreign stuff.
But you're talking about reducing the size of government. That never happens. Go on.
I agree with you. I mean, I don't think I've mentioned to you one of my favorite sayings, which is that the pigs will never destroy the trough. And
Is that from Animal Farm? No, I'm just.
no, that's a genuine Nickism. I claim that one. But it's the basis of my belief that we are heading towards a time of crisis, leading to a time of chaos, out of which we will have major changes in our systems.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
That's the optimistic view, and I'm
well, I'd love to see some major changes, because the systems that we have today they just can't meet the demand of today. It's just there's just such a mismatch between what we need and what we have, that
Absolutely.
What we have has to change.
And the only way you can make major changes, coming back to your valid point that government never wants to give up on income or any form of power that it has attained, it only
Mm-hmm.
likes to add to whatever they've got, then the only way that you can start again is revolution.
Right.
There's no option. Chaos.
Do you see Canadians taking up arms against the state? I don't know.
No, I don't. But I do see the Americans doing so very.
It's entirely possible that it could happen here.
Do you know how many? And this number is way out of date. How many armed militias, privately funded, in the United States?
I don't know, but I'm sure that there's many.
The last number I saw, and I looked at this, must be 10 or 15 years ago, was 1,200 and something or other.
Mm-hmm.
So do I think that the US is going to break up and that there's going to be all sorts of issues? Yes. Do I think Canada is going to revolt? No, but they're going to be overloaded, because there are a lot of people, maybe you'll return to Canada, there are a lot of people who will want to cross over, and we don't have the facilities here in Canada to handle an additional 10 million people coming in from the United States. And yet they'll come, and it'll overload the system. And so while I'm not sure it's going to be revolution, hopefully what will happen is that the US will, in some senses, lead the way. They'll have their chaos. My guess, for what it's worth, not much, it's what you paid for it, so that's what you're getting, that the US will break up. I don't think there's any doubt about that.
There's a good possibility. I mean, it doesn't say anywhere that we need to have this number of states in the Union. I mean, you could easily break up into separate countries, and it's already looking like it's going to.
And it's already looking like it is, from a social point of view.
Well, see, that's the thing. It's like, you probably know this, but many people outside of the United States look at us and go, what kind of a country are you, right? I don't get it. And the reality is that we aren't one country. We're 50 little countries that just happen to work together on some things. But other than that, each state, I mean, that's the whole, what is it? The 10th Amendment of the Constitution? Like all powers are the state's powers, except for the ones that we've expressively said that are federal. So the states have way more powers. So it's like the opposite of Canada, because Canada is like a strong federal state with provinces that are weak. We have strong provinces, and the federal government is supposedly weaker. So that's why each individual state is almost like an individual country. So these can all do completely different things. You could be on this side of a border, that side of a border, and you can have a completely different set of laws, a completely different set of cultures. It's amazing what it's like, but it really is like 50 little individual countries with all different attitudes.
And I think that's true. I'm not sure I accept that. I agree that most Canadian provinces are weak. But we basically do have a federation here. Mm-hmm. We do not have a single country. It was one of the most difficult things for me to grab hold of when I came over from England, just to look at this country that I was now living in and start to understand that it wasn't one country. It really, and there's a world of difference. I mean, you want to talk about BC on one hand, and Nova Scotia, Newfoundland,
Right.
Quebec. I mean, these are all,
well, the BC and the Prairie provinces and Ontario, Quebec, and the eastern provinces could all be separate countries, just like we could be, you know, California,
exactly.
Texas, Florida could all be separate countries. Do you see that coming? I mean, it's entirely possible, no?
Yeah, I think it's quite possible. I mean, there's been a lot of discussion about the Western states and BC, the Pacific Seaboard, as becoming more of a country. I don't think that will happen, because I think in the collapse, California is going to have enough problems trying to deal with itself.
Well, no, I mean, that's been for a while now, right? They were talking about a mythical new country called Pacifica, which would stretch all the way from Alaska down to Mexico, and it would be all of the border states plus BC.
Yes, and geographically, it makes some sort of sense.
Oh yeah, of course it would lock off that whole chunk of the United States to the Pacific Ocean, but that's a different story.
Well, what was I watching? I was watching a show, and it was a well-known one. I'm trying to remember what it was, but basically it was into the future, and the United States was divided into three countries. It was the West country, the East country, and a lawless center. I can't remember what the show was, but it'll come to me. But anyway, so do I think it will? Yeah, I think inevitably, you know, one of the aspects of that is serious discussion today about country size. There's long been talk of a reversion to the country state, to the city state, as an independent. I mean, we do have some examples of that. Singapore is a good example.
Oh yeah, I mean, if you think about it, I mean, cities as they are now, the cultures are completely different from the rest of the country. Like, especially if you look at Toronto and the rest of Canada, there's completely different cultures there. And it's the same where the San Francisco Bay Area and the rest of California, because if you look at all the high density areas of the country, these are all, you know, have one specific culture, and the low density areas have a completely different culture. So there is a lot of that separation going on.
And so if one follows that logical approach, then a breakup is more than just a breakup into 50 states, or however many provinces we have now, 12 including the territories, right? So that's a trend that is likely to continue, however, whatever happens. And certainly if you have some form of chaos, then you will have areas which basically get together and say, look, the rest of the world is going crazy, but there are enough sensible people around here. Let's form a community and let's deal with the rest of the world.
See, that's where I think there's a bit of fallacy here, because we're talking about geographic areas, right? But there's no reason why they have to be geographic. I mean, I don't know if I mentioned this before, but in my ideal world is that you could just live wherever you are, but then you could be but be on a completely different set of laws based on who you voted for, right? So you'd have multiple presidents and multiple regimes in the same country, and it's only because, you know, you voted for that person, that's the regime that's the laws that you were under, and all we'd have to do is deal with transgressions between the two regimes, right? So for example, let's say it's the United States and we have three presidents. We have a Democrat president, a Republican president, and a Libertarian president. Whichever you voted for, that's the regime that you're living under, even though you're living in the same place as your next door neighbor who voted Democrat. They have to follow the Democrat rules, and I have to follow the Libertarian rules, and so has to follow the Republican rules. And only when there's conflicts between the different types of people do we have to deal with that?
Of course, that's an interesting and logical thought, and which I've heard before. There are some interesting practical problems, like who looks after the sewage.
Yeah, it's like, who pitches in on that? It's like, well, if I'm a
Yes.
libertarian, I'm just going to handle my own sewage, right? So
That's
I'll just
right.
take
You're
my
individualists. But so, and you know, and water supply and energy and
yeah,
and transportation and infrastructures.
yeah. It all falls apart when you talk about those common resources, right?
But I do think I think it does to some extent. But I think that one thing that will come out of this pandemic, which is the virtual existence as we are now, I think that will lead to more virtual communities.
Mm-hmm.
And while it may well be that we have to live with whoever's screwing up the the utilities locally, well, you laugh. You have they banned golf courses yet in California?
I don't know. They still have golf courses.
But and they're still made of grass, aren't they? But we won't talk about the water problem in California. Whatever those issues are, that there may be a stronger trend towards virtual communities based on mutual values.
Yeah.
And somehow we'll deal with some of the practical matters associated with it. I think there's a decent argument to be made for that to happen. There was somebody made an observation. I talked to a bunch of people, not all for YouTube purposes, broadcasting, and I was talking to somebody from Zambia.
Mm-hmm. Nice.
Interesting, and interestingly, an interesting background. He's also Singularity University, which is where I met him. He was brought up in Ireland, but he's Jordanian in background.
Oh, interesting.
Now living in Zambia.
Mm-hmm.
So interesting. But we were talking about this, and I had a thought, which is that maybe one of the standard problems that Western democracies are facing is at least in my opinion, is the collapse of the family unit and all that came with that.
Yeah. Well, again, we're based on that. Like all of our taxation is based on that. Our culture is based on that. Everything's based on these models that are obsolete, or they're moving into obsolescence. But go on.
Yeah, I was going to say it's not just moving into obsolescence, but that the impact on society of the loss of the nuclear family is very high. I know I'm going to sound a little more Republican than anything else in terms of that, but I do think that we're losing values, good values. And part of that transition is the move from agricultural locations, from the farming communities, to the cities. Cities have better jobs. Cities have universities. So children do not want to get up at 5 every morning to milk the cows. And so they say, no way, I'm moving to the city. And that's been a standard migration for many years. If you look in a virtual environment, they don't have to move to the city to get the advantages that they're looking for from the city. Exactly
right. And the people are moving away from the city, especially during the pandemic, because they can get more in other geographies than they can, and continue to make as much or work for the same companies, do the same kind of work anywhere.
So in that situation, does that mean that the lack of migration will promote stronger family ties?
Well, that's a good question, because if you go out, I mean, one of the things that people do when they go to the city is they disconnect from their family, right? And when they come back to the town or the village they were born in, then they can reconnect to the family, or they can continue to stay isolated, or they can go to a completely different community that has nothing to do with them. So the question remains is if they will they maintain the same cultural milieu that they have when we go to back to a village, or will they bring some of that back with them? So it's like all these red states worried about blue people coming in and voting Democrat.
That's right.
So there's going to be this great sort of like blending of cultures, like city culture and rural cultures are just going to sort of mash up because everyone's going everywhere, right? So it's going to be like, you know, everyone was complaining about rush hour. Oh, everyone's rushing to the city and then rushing home at night. And now it'll be like everybody going in all directions, or nobody traveling at all because everybody will be working remotely. So it's going to, I think it's really going to, it's going to even out sort of the cultural centers. So some of the centers that are less populated are going to grow, and some of the cities are going to shrink, and it's all going to sort of level out across the board. But you're still going to see that same kind of connectivity sort of brought to these other places, and vice versa. So maybe it'll get better. But I think that you're right about one of the things about the family unit is that I think the family unit is breaking up. Like we don't have the nuclear family anymore. We've gone from tribes to families to individuals. And now sort of like the main unit of humanity is going to be an individual, because I'm sure that there's lots of people who aren't even thinking about having families or having mates or getting married or having families or anything like that. I think that's why we're seeing the birth rate, you know, diving so much, is that this culture is no longer that interested in sort of progressing the species as it used to be, because you know, that's part of the original nuclear family values.
Well, I think it's beyond nuclear family. When my bankruptcy happened in 2014, and I was looking for where do I go where I can afford to live on a very limited pension, I went to Panama for a few months and came back to Penticton. But I got an offer from somebody who I can't say he was a real friend, but he was somebody I knew fairly well. And he lived in, what's it called? Used to be called Cyprus, Ceylon.
Sri Lanka.
Sri Lanka. He lives in Sri Lanka, and he has a family compound. And he actually invited me to just move there. Said, I'll put you up, I'll look after you. I wasn't prepared to move that far away to an environment that I'd never encountered.
That would have been a great adventure, though, don't you think? I would have done that.
I did think about it. I didn't want to lose the connection with the friends and family that I have, and also I was concerned about my reaction to the climate, and as it happens, when I went to Panama, it was the climate that drove me back. I couldn't handle the humidity.
It is. I know that climate, that tropical climate is really tough.
I was told after they tried to deal with all the problems I was having, I was told by a doctor, look, we don't have a solution. Stay inside in the air conditioning. Oh no. That was his recommendation. And that was the point at which I said, I got to go back to Canada and find somewhere else. So yeah, it was the concern about climate and the difference and the dependence on someone who I didn't really know that well. But the reason I brought him up was the whole concept of a family compound. That's the family farm.
Yeah.
In the city.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I can see that happening. I think there's going to be divergence, right? You're going to have sort of people who are digital nomads who are on their own, and they're on their own, and they prefer to be digital nomads. I think that's going to be the majority of people, but then there's going to be clusters of individuals who are going to grow families that are larger than just sort of a nuclear family. And you see something like that. I mean, I don't know if you watch The Expanse, but one of the main characters actually has 8 sets of parents.
Interesting.
because they live in a family compound in the north, like Minnesota, in that area or something like that. And he's got I think he's got 4 dads and 4 moms.
Well,
So
that's not much different than the communes or the kibbutzim.
yeah. So they're saying that's probably, I mean, they're predicting that, and I think we're probably going to see that going in that direction. So we're going to see the individualists going off and being digital nomads and not wanting to step down anywhere, and then we're going to see another set of people who will have, you know, either the nuclear family or larger families. And I think we're just going to see sort of like almost like a splitting or a great variation in the kinds of humanity that we have. I mean, right now we're still seeing sort of the laggard bits of the culture of the last century and before, you know, starting to fall into place. But now that we have the mobility and the ability to be anywhere and do anywhere and do anything from anywhere, then we're going to see this huge splintering of individuals and types of living arrangements and societies across the board. And, you know, some things are going to be more free in some countries and other things are going to be less free in other countries. But I think we're going to see that kind of splintering. And I think it's a disruption for everybody, because, you know, marketers are like, okay, I need to know all of these things to sell you stuff. And governments are going to be like, oh, I need to know all these things to educate you on these things. And nothing will fit anything. So we'll have to expect that sort of disruption to occur.
I think it will occur, and I'm just trying to. Does the name Tom Dyson mean anything to you?
I know the name Dyson, but I'm not sure. He's not related to the Dyson family.
No, he writes a financial column.
No.
And what does he call it? Letters from the Fringe or postcards from the Fringe. But the interesting thing about him is that he is the digital nomad that you're talking about.
Mm-hmm.
But he has a wonderful story. Married, 3 young children, living the conventional life in, I think, Florida. But obviously mixed up. He's London born and bred, and has a mental breakdown, family breakup, goes off to Scotland for part of the time. I mean, he was just traveling, trying to sort of find himself and stabilize. And meanwhile, his ex-wife developed another relationship and looked after the children. And at one point, she was talking about taking the children on a motorhome type of trip around the US.
Mm-hmm.
And invited him to come along. And meanwhile, he sort of settled down and was in much better mental shape. And he came on that trip with them, not as a relationship. He had his girlfriend, and as a result of that trip, though, they decided to ditch their respective mates and go on. And initially, maybe for most of the time, it wasn't as a couple.
Mm-hmm.
They were living together, but not necessarily as a couple. And they had
Right.
3 children. And they traveled around the world.
Mm-hmm.
They traveled to Europe, they traveled through India, they traveled extensively through China. And during that time, he started writing notes to his friends, and that became postcards from.
What decade was this?
I guess he probably left 2017, 18.
Oh, okay. So it's recent. Because I've heard of another family doing something like that too, but it was back in the 60s. So
no, I mean, what I love about this is, and I love a good love story. They have now remarried, but they still regard themselves as digital nomads, and they are thinking of settling down for a little bit in London. His mother died, leaving the family home, and he wasn't sure about selling it. So, but the point I'm making is the education that the kids got was a totally unconventional. It was homeschooled in a totally different way.
Yeah.
And they are nomads. They own nothing. From an investment point of view, they put all their money into gold. And they are sticking with it until a Dow gold ratio changes to 5. But that is a whole different story. But the reason I brought it up was this concept of a nomadic family that has no roots, has no home, have very few possessions. I mean, they were traveling, the only possessions they had was one suitcase.
That seems so abnormal, but it's going to become more and more normal, and it's going to become, in some cases, it's going to be preferred, right? Because if you look at the cost of buying real estate and settling down somewhere, I mean, it's almost not worth it, especially in these places. Like, I don't know what my kids are going to do, because the cost to get into a place here in Silicon Valley is unbelievably high. So, you know, unless they have multiple incomes and there's like 4 or 5 people in the family who are making money, then they're never going to be able to afford it. But that is it's an option. And have you seen the new movie Nomadland?
No.
Okay. So basically it's about someone who lives on her own. She lives out of a van, and she goes to various places, and it's actually a nonfiction book that they turned into a movie, right? And there's this sort of dignity in allowing her to have her freedom and independence to go anywhere she wants and do whatever she wants. She's offered everywhere she goes. People say, oh, they feel pity for her because she's in this van and she's driving around and that's her home. But she likes it that way. That's the freedom that she's looking for. And there's a whole community of people who are like that. And I think we're going to see more and more people who are like that. People who live in tiny homes, people who live in vans and RVs, who want to just be mobile and go to places. And they can still have full-time jobs and work for whoever company when, but they can do it from anywhere in the world, in any country. I mean, I know people right now who've moved to Thailand and they still work for companies in the United States. So we're going to see this mobility happening all over the place, and it's just going to be this really interesting breakup of the way things were. And I think a lot of people are not going to be able to handle it anymore. And all institutions can only handle things the way they were, and they can't understand some of these new models of living.
And of course, coming back to concepts like income tax, when you have people who wander all over, it destroys the model of income tax collection. You've got now, I don't know whether you've noticed this, but there's a recent effort by I don't know how many countries and organizations. They want to establish a minimal corporate tax, so that the companies that are scattered around the world that decide to have their headquarters in Belarus or Ireland or wherever it is.
Because there's no tax.
That's right. That they are being frustrated by the countries are frustrated by the lack of tax. And it's an interesting situation, because the current corporate tax level that is being proposed is 15%, but in the European Union, you have to get 100% agreement from all the member states in order to implement something like that. And Ireland and a couple of other countries are saying no, because they're using very low corporate income tax to attract companies to them.
Exactly.
And they had to go with 15. Now,
if it's a global tax, then people are just going to stay where they are, and they're not going to be able to draw people to Ireland. In fact, people may even leave Ireland to go back to their original countries.
Although actually, I mean, they're making a big fuss about it. But if I were running the Irish economy, I'd probably be crazy. But let's leave that one alone. I'm in trouble with all of my Irish friends now. But if I were, I would say, fine, we'll charge 15, and those people that come and settle here, we'll give them an annual grant You know, it doesn't have to
Yeah,
be
to alleviate the 15.
15%, you'll
Yeah.
balance it. And just coming back almost all the way to your question about wealth tax.
Mhm.
That's the problem with a wealth tax, is firstly the definition, which is a horrendous thing. The French have had wealth tax for years, and the process is so arbitrary that it's incredible. I mean, the tax assessor will come to your home, literally, look around, see the quality of the paintings on the wall, and decide what your wealth is. That's what they did.
Wow.
I'm not sure they still have. But of course, what the wealthy people do, which is the people you really want to get at, is they will then arrange that they'll be located in a different place.
Yep.
And so the wealth tax never works.
No.
And the numbers prove that.
Yeah. So I think we can answer your question then. We have to go to a pure consumption tax, because that will also solve the digital nomad issue.
Yes, absolutely. Wherever you are, you pay for whatever you buy, and you pay, and the consumption tax goes to the place where you buy it.
Exactly.
Exactly correct.
Yep.
So yeah, I think we've solved today.
See, we can agree on something.
We've solved the tax issue. We haven't solved any of the other issues. And
that's a topic for the next show, because I think we're running a little bit out of time here. So
we are running out of time.
What was the next topic? What was the next question that you asked to tee people up for the next one?
Well, I still think we have to solve this paid employment issue. I don't think we've dealt with
paid employment. Everyone's going to have paid employment.
No one will have paid employment. No, I see somewhere between the two, but I do have a world vision. I think I talked about it last time, but I think maybe what we should do is set it up at the beginning of the talk and use that as the basis of our rambles. Of our
yeah. No, that sounds good. But we also have question 3, so maybe we'll need 2 more shows to finish this up.
Look. You want to? I mean, the next one which is making wise next job decisions.
Mm-hmm.
I've got a whole system that I've defined, and there are a whole bunch of things to discuss within that system.
Oh, I'd love to hear that, and then we can move back to the question of paid work.
Let's finish paid employment next time, and we will probably, we've tried to twice, maybe third time lucky, to close that loop a little bit. Look, do you want me to sort of set up a weekly thing? Does that, until you say no? I'm happy to do it that way.
Let's do one more.
Okay.
Let's do one more, and then because we already have one more, and then we'll set up another one after that. Yeah.
Tuesday is set up, and what you want to do after that is up to you. I love these chats.
Sounds good. We could absolutely keep it going. Well, thank you so much, sir. It was great talking with you. I love these conversations. We are talking about the future here, so it's still part of the whole concept of where we're going.
Think future. Absolutely.
All right, sir. Have a great weekend.
Okay. You too, Chris. Bye-bye.
Later.
Long weekend.